Hello, good afternoon to all. We have here Edward Wilson Lee, an historian that surprisingly, for us Portuguese, wrote a book that their two main characters are very well-known Portuguese writers. One is a poet, the other is a chronic, he writes chronics. It's Damião de Góis and Luís de Camões. I think don't need to introduce them. So I would thought to start question Mr. Edward why this choice, but when I see his biography, I don't resist, because it says in his biography that he grew up in Kenya and Switzerland, which is two countries that I cannot, it's so opposite that, well, can you talk us a little, and then Mexico, Zimbabwe, and the United States. So can you, to start, tell us a little bit about your experience, because it's so unusual too.
Absolutely, desculpe, eu não vou falar na português. I won't butcher your language. Embora que sou lusófilo, meu português falado não é tão forte. So I will speak in English. I'm a great reader of Portuguese, but my Portuguese accent, I'm afraid, is not very good. So I suppose the combination of things makes a bit more sense if you think about the course of the 20th century. So my parents met in East Africa. Both of them had gone out to work for, they're both wildlife conservationists. My father's, the headquarters of the organization that he worked for was in Switzerland. So when I went to boarding school, I was sent to boarding school in Switzerland. But the other combination of places, there's long stories behind them, but I suppose kind of like the characters in the book, I'm perennially itchy-footed is one way to think of it, or the other way is that nowhere will have me for very long, so I'm continually being moved along. So that's part of the background to that. Okay.
And so can you tell us why did you found interest in these two characters, these two Portuguese characters?
Yeah. I mean, my work is as an early modernist, so I work on this period, I teach the literature of this period, and I work on the history of this period. I'm particularly interested in the phenomena of global encounter. So what it was like, the sort of last age of globalization, and what impact these encounters with cultures so radically different had upon Europe in the period. And of course, in order to talk about that, Portugal is at the is at the leading edge of those encounters. The Portuguese, so the book that I wrote before this was about the Spanish encounter with the New World, and I wanted to think about the encounter with the East, with India and China, and so obviously that was going to mean talking about Portuguese people. And as I say, so having grown up in Kenya, I knew I knew the Lusiads from a young age. Of course, Camões' poem, The Lusiads, and its narrative of Vasco da Gama's voyages. Significant episodes take place in Mombasa, and of course, growing up in Kenya, there are the remnants of Portuguese presence there. There's Fort Jesus. There's the Padrão that was erected, or a version of the Padrão that was erected there. Camões, when I started writing about global encounter in this period, and trying to write about it in an engaging way for a more general audience, not just for academics, Camões seemed like an obvious subject to deal with. And he connected together so many different parts of my interests and my life, so he seemed like an obvious person to think about. And at one point, I had thought about just writing a biography of Camões, but as you will know, as someone who's also written about Camões is this extraordinarily elusive character. Yes, so we know very little about him. Interestingly, like Shakespeare, like that other great 16th century national poet, we know only fragmentary things about his life. He's also quite a problematic person. So Camões. And as a biographer, the idea of writing a biography about someone about whom very little is known, but also who is a highly problematic figure, it's an uncomfortable idea to think about. Spending time, many years with someone like that. So this is where Damião de Góis comes in. This is a dual biography. So Camões will be known to even non-Portuguese audiences. Non-Portuguese audiences will likely not know who Damião de Góis is. He's not a figure whose name conjures much in non-Portuguese minds. And I think, but that's actually part of the interest of the story. As a dual biography, it's partly a story about why Camões becomes famous and revered and celebrated, and Damião de Góis disappears. And I think, in part, this is because they have profoundly different reactions to this moment of global encounter, to this moment of globalization. And I think that they're, in some ways, they symbolize a fork in the road, different ways to react to the shock of meeting a culture that is very different than yours, and to having the way that you thought the world worked pulled away from you. And one that I think is quite telling and quite important for our own moment. So we're going now through another period of hyper-globalization. Overnight, in historical terms, the last 20 years, technologies have arisen and ways of living have arisen that mean that we are incredibly globally connected, right? People fly all over the world. I've come over from Cambridge for a couple of days to be at this festival. But we also have, each of us in our pockets all the time, a device that can connect us instantaneously to anywhere in the world. So in some ways, this is an extraordinary moment of globalization. But being in that moment made me want to think about the last moment of globalization and why it happened in the way that it did, and why it didn't happen differently. Why, in a way, despite becoming much more connected at this time 500 years ago than we had ever been in previous human history, that it was a very partial globalization, economic globalization, but less cultural globalization, right? So, as I say in the book, English school children didn't immediately start learning Chinese in school, or the Vedas and the Mahabharata didn't suddenly begin being taught in French universities. So I think thinking about how these moments of globalization happen, and why one chooses one path rather than another is it's an important thing to do right now, because I think we face that choice again.
Okay, I think we will go back to globalization, but the two characters you construct in this book, after great research, I would say, the notes are very interesting. You give us, normally the Portuguese, when they talk about Camões, they talk more about the work than about the man, because the man was taught to us as a myth.
There's a good reason for that.
Yes, but the man was taught to us as a myth. The time of the fascism in Portugal, there was a biography of Camões written by a member of the regime that told us mainly that he was a very strong man, that all the women fall for him. He doesn't have to do much, It was like a Don Juan-like. So, he was brave. He fight against the enemies of Portugal, and finally, he was a great poet. But of course, nationalist and patriotic, and he died with the fatherland. I mean, in the year he died, the fatherland died because the Spanish took over. Okay, this is not it's interesting as a myth for children and for adults with problems, but you give us a completely different image of Camões. Can you, for this audience, without many spoilers, because I think you should read the book, And tell us what's Camões, after all, from your point of view, from your perspective. Not the true Camões, but from your perspective, after all your research, after all you read, all the letters. The letters are very important, right? Antonia, I was very puzzled with your book. Actually, I am enjoying it very much. So, can you tell us what you think of Camões?
Yes, I mean, that's obviously a total, the biography that you describe is a total fabrication, but in some ways it's fitting because Camões was a master of reinvention, self-reinvention, and telling stories about himself, the stories that helped at the time. So, partly, why Ricardo invited me to come over for this is we're celebrating what the 500th anniversary of what may be Camões' birth, but the fact that we don't even know when he was born is very telling. So his early life is very patchily known, right?
There's a book by Mário Sá, is a Portuguese poet from the beginning of the 20th century. It's called The Astrologic Memoirs of Camões. I don't know if you've been through it.
Yeah.
Well, there's a verse of Camões that said, when I get out, well, I'll say in Portuguese, quando saí da materna sepultura, é verso horrível. It's an awful verse. When I get out of my mother's graveyard, means my mother's grave, some stars were in the skies. He said like this. So through that, people try to fix his date of birth, which would be around 23 February or something like that. Yeah, these stars were.
Yes.
But this is just the only concrete reference. It's not concrete. It's a poetic reference.
Well, it's one of the kind of wonderful things that happens with canonical writers, isn't it? That because having any kind of new information about them has such a premium, that this competitive interpretation develops, and any tidbit of information. But yeah, so we know very little about his early life. He may have been likely born in Lisbon, maybe not. Spent some time at Coimbra, possibly. But again. The idea that in that biography that he had a kind of easy time with the women is again ironic because a lot of Camões' story is about his lack of romantic success. So again, after possibly spending time at university, he moves to Lisbon. He writes love poetry. He goes off to serve in North Africa, and he loses possibly in his military service in North Africa. He loses an eye. Again, this makes him even less successful with the ladies. So there's a lot of stories about him being mocked, has an eyeless face and all these things. But yes, so. Part of the confusion about Camões' life is that almost entirely his early life disappeared from view during his own lifetime and in the myth that grew up about him afterwards. And it was only in the early 20th century that a number of these letters that Camões wrote in his youth were rediscovered. And they gave some sense of the kind of grimy underworld that Camões lived in, right? So, like many young men of the period, quite often in the 16th century, young men were packed off to university. They were given this humanist education, how to read and recite Latin poetry, and how to compose, compose sonnets and things like this. And then they were released off into the world, and there really wasn't very much for them to do. In ways that are quite similar in a way to our own world. They're given these educations, and then they're released off sonnet writing Latinate young men with nothing to do, and they congregate in Lisbon. And the world that we see in Camões' early letters is this sort of relentless, cruel, rather grimy underworld of Lisbon, where he's writing to a friend in the country. His letters, a lot of them are about what's happening with the Lisbon prostitutes. So they all have their favorite prostitutes. And he's telling his friend in the country, because he's sure that what his friend in the country wants to hear is what's happening with the prostitutes. These prostitutes live in an unbearably harsh world where they are constantly being, beaten and murdered in the course of trying to do their business. And Camões lives in this world. He's constantly in trouble, and in fact this is what ends up changing his life, that he gets involved, at least he's accused of being involved in a street brawl in which an important courtier is roughed up, is hurt, and as a punishment for this he is required to spend 3 years in the India fleet, right? So the Portuguese India fleet, and he's sent off to that, and he actually spends a lot longer than 3 years. He spends 17 years bumping around the Indian Ocean, and it's during that time that he becomes the Camões of the Lusíads, the epic poet of global encounter and of sea voyage and so on and so forth.
You say in your book that the Lusíads started to be written in the island of Mozambique, and did they finish it there?
No, so it's not that it starts to be written, but that the opening scene.
Oh yeah.
So it's as an epic. It starts in medias res, right? So the opening scene starts in just off the coast of Mozambique.
Okay, the narrative.
Yeah. So the narrative starts there. Yeah. Yes. So Camões, as I say, part of the kind of interest of Camões' life is how he goes from this character who's constantly being thrown in jail and is constantly in debt and can't find meaningful employment. How he goes from that to becoming the Portuguese national poet is, a kind of mystery, but it's a mystery that the book tries to think about and tries to solve. And I think it's partly, part of the answer is about the power of narrative that Camões offers in this moment of global encounter, when Europe suddenly has its sense of its own place in the world violently removed from it, that Camões offers to the Portuguese and even more broadly to the Europeans a heroic narrative of the European place in the world that becomes particularly appealing, and it's for that reason that that the Lusíads becomes this kind of celebrated epic, and that Camões himself becomes a sort of revered figure. And again, very conveniently, the fact that not much is known about his life means that he can be all things to all men, right? That we don't have to deal with the uncomfortable truths of his life, and he can be this, this soldier poet figure that the world wants him to be.
And we want to be too. It's in the times of early 18th century. 19th century, with the Romanticism, that's when the world, like say Europe, praised Camões, right?
Yeah.
And the Lusíads as a great epic,
yep.
As Hegel said, perhaps the greatest of epics.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, what about Damião de Góis? He was a Jew converted, right? He came from a Jewish family?
Well, I don't think there's firm evidence of that. Again, Damião's background is so beyond a couple of generations back. There are, there's less evidence. He was certainly someone who was very importantly supportive of the Novos Christiãos, the converted Jewish people. So Damião de Góis, for those of you who don't know about him, is this extraordinary polymathic figure from the 16th century. So he grows up at the court of King Manuel, where he's a page, but then he goes on to live across Europe. And among other things, he is the first author for European audiences of works on Ethiopian culture, works on the Lappish culture or the culture of the Sami in northern Scandinavia. He is the only Portuguese figure in the period to translate the Bible. He's an accomplished polyphonic musician who writes in the style of Josquin des Prés, the great polyphonic composer. He is one of the early collectors of the works of Hieronymus Bosch. He is a friend of Erasmus and Luther, and he knows Luther and Melanchthon. He even tries a kind of ill-fated, single-handed attempt to stop the Reformation in its tracks by getting everyone together and to agree on things. But he's the reason why he was particularly important for this book is that later in life he becomes the garde-mort of the Torre de Tombo archive in Lisbon, so the King's archive in Lisbon. And there he writes the official account of the Portuguese encounter with India and with China and Japan, those early years of the encounter. But Damião is he's entirely antithetical as a figure to Camões. So he is this sponge who's just utterly fascinated about the things of the world that he encounters. So he also writes a fantastic guidebook to Lisbon, but he gets distracted very early on in it and spends quite a lot of the first 10 pages or so talking about mermen. Right, so apparently there have been sightings of mermen off the coast of Lisbon, and he goes on for pages and pages about aquatic people who live in the ocean, and all of the stories that he's heard about them from fishermen and from children and so on and so forth. And again, our temptation is to think of this as evidence of his credulousness, right? His naivety. But in some ways, it's actually representative of his just fascination with everything about the world, right? So like one of those Bosch paintings that he collected, which is, if you know the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, they're filled with these bizarre creatures that are part human, part animal, part object, Bosch's paintings, I think, show a fascination with the possibilities of variety in the world. And Damião was very much like this as well. So his one of the extraordinary things about his chronicles of this period are the fact that they are absolutely full of just wonder about the world that the Portuguese are seeing. So he writes about fireworks in Malacca and the first encounter with the durian fruit. He writes an awful lot about fruit and food. There's another great reason to love Damião de Góis. He recounts in extraordinary detail all of the food that's found everywhere. He tells you about what the oranges are like in Bengal, and how the Chinese, when the Portuguese first encountered them, are felt to be people that they could deal with. And the reason why they feel this is because the Chinese like drinking, just like the Europeans like drinking. He says they drink just like Germans, and therefore they must be good people, right? We could do business with these people. And of course, what you forget is
the Muslims don't drink.
Yes. So this is the background to it, and of course this is how Camões. So I don't know if Glenn, who was here earlier talking about the Lord of the Rings. Sorry, not Glenn. Sorry, Nick, who was here earlier talking about the Lord of the Rings, and of course packed from has the advantage of a story that still has people eating out of its hand. And I think one of the reasons is that the Lord of the Rings, if I can say this without being pathetic, the Camões was the Lusiads was kind of the Lord of the Rings of its day. That the Lord of the Rings offers us a comforting fantasy of a world of black and white, a world in which the enemy is easily identifiable and can be killed with a sword, right? And the world in which we live, in which actually, quite often the problems we have to deal with are much more slippery than that. Dealing with climate change, dealing with, the holes in the economy which are bleeding, tax out to multinational corporations that are situated everywhere, so on and so forth. All of these problems are very hard to know how to fight. So it's nice to have a story in which, the villain lives in an identifiable mountain somewhere, and all you have to do is go there and stab him in the heart, or throw a ring in the volcano, and poof, everything's better, right? That's a lovely story. And I think, again, one of the things that Camões does narratively to make this story for the Europeans is he essentially turns this into a black and white thing, a battle of good and evil, Christianity against Islam. So again, he returns Europe, in a sense, to that comforting narrative that they've had throughout the Middle Ages with the Chanson de Roland and the Crusades, of an identifiable opposite number, an identifiable enemy, and therefore a discrete task of what you have to do, which is to defeat that enemy. Whereas, I think one of the reasons why this is so appealing is because actually Europe's encounter with the wider world was profoundly unsettling. A lot of the time, I think they just didn't know what to do with what they were encountering. So they had a narrative of European culture and of divine providence and of the shape of the world and the shape of history. And suddenly they're meeting people who belong entirely outside of that, who have their own cultures, which are incredibly sophisticated, but have no role in that narrative of history, and who think of the world in incredibly different ways. Again, one of the things that both Damião and Camões come to, or things like the nature of time, right? So within a Christian Abrahamic context, time begins with creation. There's a countable number of generations, and then judgment will come. The world will end. In Abrahamic cultures, the end is always nigh. Yeah, it's going to happen, right? And then you suddenly encounter Indian cultures, in which we're in the fourth age, the age of Kali. The world has already existed for millions of years, and is going to exist for at least 400,000 more years. So, that central element of European culture, which is telling people reform because the end is nigh, it's very difficult to have a conversation about that with a culture who doesn't think the end is near, who thinks that. And again, similarly with the Chinese, when they meet the Chinese, they note that it's a common Chinese compliment to say, may you have 10,000 years of, may your reign last for 10,000 years, may you have 10,000 years of good luck, or whatever. You could never say that in a European context, because it would be blasphemy to suggest that the world's going to be around for another 10,000 years. The end is nigh, right? And central to so much of European morality is the idea that judgment is coming. It will be swift, and it will be brutal, and it will sort the sheep from the goats, and so on and so forth. Again, Glenn was talking about Auden's attitude towards animals. One of the ironies of this is that in the 16th century, the Europeans were encountering peoples who had profoundly different ideas about animal-human relations, who believed in transmigration of the soul, in reincarnation, and as a correlate to that, the idea that animal and human souls must in some senses be the same, right? If I can transmigrate into an animal, it must mean that the stuff of my soul could belong in an animal, right? Whereas in Christianity, that idea is it's anathema, right? So Camões, when he writes about, and again, we haven't talked about this, but so after his, I presume we'll talk about his stay in Macau at some point. But the moment at which the kind of mythology of the Lusiads is born is when he's on his way back from Macau to Goa, and he's shipwrecked in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, and supposedly he swims ashore holding a copy of the manuscript of the Lusiads above his. I'm not going to try.
No, it's impossible to do. I try it. It's impossible.
Yes, everyone.
Really, I try it, and the sea was not rough, and I am a good swimmer. It's impossible.
This is proper research.
You can't hold it always like this.
No.
But the story is, it was inside the skin of something, so it was around his chest. It was soaked, but then.
This is post facto rationalization. I would say.
No, we have to find something to say, right?
I mean. So, as others have pointed out, it's the same story that Caesar tells about his manuscript of the Civil Wars. So, in some ways, this is a borrowed story. And what it does is it emphasizes the importance of the manuscript. This is a manuscript that is somehow fated to make it home. That somehow, just like the Portuguese people are fated to have an empire, it's their destiny. They're fated to be the new Argonauts, the new Alexander. This manuscript is fated. Indeed, fated to make its way home. And again, the other story, of course, that grows up around this is about his Chinese mistress, Dinamine, who he only ever refers to, if he does refer to her at all, pseudonymously by referring to a Greek water spirit. So the story grows up that he's returning to Goa, again, to face trial, to be put in prison, as so often happened in his life. He's shipwrecked, and supposedly, again, it's never quite clear, the Chinese mistress goes down with the ship. The poem is saved. Again, it's not quite... During our early courtship, my wife used to like to ask me if the house was burning and there was me and the only copy of the complete works of Shakespeare, which one would you save? We did get married. I'm not sure how I got out of answering that one. But one of the things so Camões, one of the astonishing things, and one of the things I'm interested in this book, is Camões spends 17 years in Goa, Macau, in the being shipwrecked off the Mekong Delta. He says very little about Indian culture, about Chinese culture. He says, and again, the Brahminical culture that was in that area of the Mekong Delta in that day. He says very little about it. But the one thing he does say, and I think this is a real tell, it really shows what it is that's so difficult for Europeans. He talks about, he says, this is a people who believe that the same judgment comes after death to a flea as to a human, right? And this is, again, part of that idea of reincarnation, that everything is part of the great kind of circle of life. To a European mind frame, the idea that the world is not anthropocentric, that the narrative of the world is not tied to man's personal destiny, but that even a flea has a part in this story, in this world machine. In this world machine, exactly. Yes, exactly. In the great machine of the world. It is profoundly challenging, and again, one of the and I could go on. The length of or the nature of time. The relationship between humans and animals, the nature of sexuality. Again, the Europeans were encountering forms of sexuality which were profoundly different to their own, and which they found very problematic. And of course, the great irony is that 400 years of European imperialism sets out, among many other things, to stamp out these ideas, right? To convert people to Christianity in a particular notion of the length of time, to convert people to an idea of the human soul, in which that idea that humans and animals are somehow the same could not exist, to enforce a particular kind of normative sexuality, only in the late 20th century to make a complete turnaround. Of course, we now all think that the time is much more like the Indians would have conceived it. We now all are desperately trying to reimagine the world as a place in which animals have the kind of importance and the same kind of sacredness as humans, right? Animal rights and so on and so forth. A world in which people should be allowed to live their romantic and sexual lives as they please. The enormous irony of this, of course, is that these are precisely the things that the Europeans encountered 500 years ago when they went out into the world. They were horrified by them, and they spent hundreds of years trying to stamp them out, only now to, miraculously discover and to head back into the world to preach exactly the opposite, right? You must you must allow people sexual rights. You must have due respect for animal rights. You must believe in this scientific narrative of the world and not in any kind of superstitious narrative of the world which accepts the great longitude of time, etc., etc. So there's an extraordinary irony to what happens in this moment, I suppose.
You were talking about the apocalypse and the Abrahamic religions that always put
Happy
the apocalypse
Saturday.
as today is the Sabbath. And I immediately remember a sentence of Freud that says that believing in the apocalypse or believing that the world is going to finish with you, it's the first symptom of narcissism. So this might say something about our own societies, right? Not an individual narcissism, but a social narcissism. Yep. And so it's a social narcissism. Your own reflection is always a distorted one, of course, a grander one. And what I found also interesting in your book that I would like to refer a little bit was the contradictions inside Europe itself through Damião de Góis and how he finished his life. I think that's very interesting also to talk about.
Yes, so absolutely. So you've got these two different responses to the encounter with other cultures. And obviously we know what happens. We know that Europe follows a path of imperialism that wears a neoclassical garb, so everything becomes very Greek and Roman. Even here in Macau, you've got columns and everything everywhere, and that's part of a European narrative that they, there's a pure descent of European culture from Greek and Roman culture, and that allows them to construct narratives of cultural superiority and so on and so forth. So, and Camões plays a central part in that. Okay, the Lusiads has very little about Indian or Chinese culture. It has an awful lot about Greek and Roman culture, right? There are Greek and Roman gods everywhere.
Exactly, but they fight between each other.
Yes, that's true.
So there's an inner.
Yeah.
That's like when Damião de Góis is arrested and is tortured and please.
Yes. So one of the reasons there's so much we won't be able to cover in this conversation, but one of the reasons that Damião de Góis' life is such a fascinating topic for a biographer is we know an enormous amount about it. We know an enormous amount about it for rather bleak reasons, in that he was arrested by the Inquisition late in his life, and for several years was subjected to interrogations during which he was forced to repeat the story of his life over and over and over again, looking for inconsistencies, looking for, to catch him out in a lie. And because of this, we know an enormous amount about his life. Again, he's in this, it's an extraordinarily kind of poignant and difficult narrative, but because he's essentially brought in by the Inquisition, he doesn't know what he's done wrong, and they just say, tell us what you've done wrong. You know, the classic inquisitorial tactic of playing upon the paranoia of the imprisoned, who doesn't know what, they just want to say whatever it, you know, whatever they need to say to be released. And because of that, Damião simply gushes stories about his life for years. And so we have this extraordinarily detailed account of his life, who he met, who he ate with, what they ate. So again, wonderfully about Damião, who once coined the phrase philosophers of the belly, was himself a bit of a philosopher of the belly. He was constantly obsessed with food, and quite a lot of the trial turns around food. Right? Quite a lot of it has to do with questions of what he ate and when, and this obviously at the time of the Reformation was interpreted in particular ways as to whether or not he was orthodox, whether he was following the church rules on what you were allowed to eat and when. But again, because of this, we have these extraordinarily detailed narratives of his meals throughout his life, which again allows us to immerse ourselves in the...
It was the meal that disgraced him, right? The pork on Friday.
Yes, so this is extraordinary story, which again he tells over and over and over again, and they get in... Yeah.
I saw you eating pork on Friday.
Yes, so, well, the story as Damião tells it, and again, I won't be able to go on into too great detail, is that there's a pregnant woman who comes over to his house for lunch. And it's on a feast day, so when they're supposed a fast day, so a day when in Christian culture you're only supposed to eat fish, right? You're not allowed to eat any meat. Damião, this pregnant woman comes over for dinner, and she's feeling sick. She has morning sickness, right? She has pregnancy sickness, and Damião offers her some pork, because he thinks the saltiness of the pork will help to settle her stomach. And then again, this is where the story starts to divide. Does Damião also eat the pork? Is Damião eating the pork just to make her feel more comfortable about it? Does Damião have a license maybe so you could, Erasmus famously, when he got famous, Erasmus was the most famous man of the early 16th century. It's hard to imagine that a Latin scholar was this famous, but he was the K-pop of his day. And when he got famous, one of the popes asked him, is there anything I can do for you? And Erasmus said, yeah, I'd like a license so I can eat pork whenever I want to. So again, you could get dispensations, and there were elements to the rules that if you genuinely thought that your health was threatened, maybe you could break the fasting rules and so on and so forth. So yes. Sorry, I've gone on a tangent about Damião's food, but it's very, as you'll see if you read the book, it's utterly fascinating. In part because, again, I think this has partly to do with control, the ability of tyrannical regimes to enforce arbitrary rules, right? To say you must do this then, and not. I mean, if you wanted to do it, it would hardly be a demonstration of power, right? So to enforce these kind of arbitrary rules, but it's also again a story about globalization. I'm sure everyone here will have had. We live in this kind of interesting way where we eat. Often very globally. I've seen, here in Macau, they have McDonald's. I hope you don't have any British restaurants, because British food is awful. But you will have food, from all over the world. Similarly, there will be restaurants in Cambridge, where I live, which sell food from all over China. So often one of the ways in which we experience globalization is in a culinary sense, right? And yet people have very different reactions to that, right? So I'm sure everyone here has a grandparent who thinks of foreign food as something, nasty foreign muck. I'm not eating that. And this was very much the same in the 16th century, right? So one of the things that Vasco da Gama's pioneering of the Carrera de India, the sea route to India, one thing that it did was it made spices a lot more available, not just to kings and nobles, but to a much broader range of people. But for a lot of people, this was highly troubling, right? It profoundly changed the rhythm of life in which certain foods were eaten in certain seasons. And many of these key religious characters in the 16th century, so Luther, but also Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, spend a lot of time talking about how problematic it is that everyone's eating so many spices, right? That the Lenten fast, the period before Easter, when Christians are not supposed to are supposed to kind of fast, they're supposed to eat only fish, they're supposed to be focusing on death and mortality and the sacrifice of Christ for humanity, that's all gone out the window because they are eating fish, but they're covering their fish with pepper and cloves and all of these spices that are coming from India and Malacca, the Spice Islands, and elsewhere. This is for Luther and for Loyola a profoundly problematic thing, right? In that it's self-indulgence. It's losing the spirit of how people are supposed to live and what Lent is supposed to mean and how Lent fits into the seasonal calendar of the European year. It's that period just before things start to bloom and fruit starts to be available and fresh vegetables start to be available. So it has a sort of deep structural place in the European mind and in the ritual calendar, and even in the digestive system, right? But that's all being completely changed by globalization and the influx of spices. So again, it's a story that's very recognizable from our own day, when suddenly this narrative that this is what we've always eaten, and now suddenly all this nasty foreign food is coming in. Again, because for a lot of people aren't out there necessarily flying across the world or anything, but the world is coming to them on their table, and they're experiencing it through what they eat, and so on and so forth. And so that's one of the most, one of the shared experiences of globalization between the 16th century and today.
Yeah, exactly. I would like to ask you, then we will maybe pass the word to the public. What lessons can we take from the first globalization, when the contact became possible, to the second globalization, where the contact became instantaneous, as you said before? Are there lessons that you can take as an historian? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, I mean, and I think so. I do think we are at a kind of profoundly troubling inflection point again. So again, we become extraordinarily globalized in some senses. We're hyper connected, and yet, in some ways, as with last time, where the globalization was profoundly economic. So as the great historian C.L.R. James, historian of the Caribbean, would put it, where he proposes the Dominican Republic and Haiti as the kind of model of the modern country, right, where everything is brought there from elsewhere, it's connected to elsewhere. So again, the first age of globalization was an age in which everything was kind of profoundly economically connected, but nationalist narratives ensured that actually there was something of a barrier put up against cultural connection, right? We all learned national canons of national literature which convinced us that there was such a thing as a national spirit, right? That we are different from them, and these are the canonical texts which show that we're different than them, that capture the national spirit. Again, that idea that poetry is something that is lost in translation. It's an interesting idea, but it's also one with profoundly nationalistic implications, that there is some kind of spirit, grace that all people of this nation share, and it creates the nation, right? It makes the nation an actual thing, as opposed to just, an artificial border that's been set up keeping other people out, or and so on and so forth. So again, we are now extraordinarily connected, but I think there's a danger that connection becomes very economic, right? Again, these multinational companies, even more than the East India Company or anything like that. You have these companies who own businesses which ship everywhere. As say, there's McDonald's here, and TikTok in England, and so on and so forth. So there's this economic connection, but the question of how much that will become a cultural connection, I think, still remains open. So there are superficial ways. Clearly, you're all watching, The Lord of the Rings. My kids love K-pop. But is it the case, now that we all have these phones in our pockets and, free social media messaging, are we all talking to people from radically different cultures all the time? Or are we simply talking to people who we would have traditionally been talking to? Are we maybe talking to people who social media companies, again, their algorithms make, part of this is to do with what social media companies and search engines assume we want to see, right? So these search algorithms return to us results that they presume that we want to see, and those are based on radical assumptions about who is like us. So again, when I search for something online, Google makes certain assumptions that I want to see something that will be appealing, that other 40-something-year-old white guys from Cambridge also would be interested in, right? But what if I don't want to see that? What if I want to see what you would be interested in? Again, there's no Google, as far as I know, there's no search engine that intentionally confronts me with what someone else might think about this, what someone else would want to see. It locks us in these bubbles, these echo chambers, in which we become increasingly convinced that our own way of seeing things is a natural way of seeing things, because we're constantly returned lots of other people who think the same as us, right? We're never returned the people who think differently from us. I think she should speak.
Narcissism again.
I would say, makes me miss my kids. Sorry. Yes, I don't know if that's, again, there's so many angles to this story that so I think we're supposed to be having some Q&A, so shall we throw that open to the floor? This one, yeah.
Just very briefly, sorry. Mm-hmm. Just curious about the very different titles in Portuguese and English. Was it your decision, the publisher's decision? Obviously the English titles are wonderful, but very curious. The Portuguese is more straightforward. Who decided? Sorry.
So the title is a kind of interesting thing, and I think a lot of people want to know about this. So the differing title in Portuguese was the Portuguese publisher's decision. So in Portuguese it's TORRE dos SEGREDOS, the Tower of Secrets. Again, they thought that A History of Water was too riddling and too cryptic. And in fact, my British publisher almost didn't allow me to have it. They thought, again, it was too obscure. And again, part of I can tell you lots of stories. So one version of this is that I've inherited from my mother several terrible habits. One of which is an addiction to puns. I cannot not make a pun if I see it. And another of which is a tendency to just invent titles for books. So my mother my mother always likes to one-up me by inventing better titles for my books once they've come out. So once my first book was about Shakespeare, again, I'm talking about this tomorrow if you're interested, Shakespeare's strange centrality to 19th and 20th century history in East Africa. It's called Shakespeare in Swahili Land. And my mother, on the day, I think, of its publication, said, oh, you should have called that A Bard in the Hand. And for the English, this would follow it. It's a joke on the phrase, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. So a bard in the hand is worth two in the bush. Anyway, so of course, so a history of water. There's lots of different meanings to the title. In part, it's intended to be a poetic riddle. It's partly, so there are lots of different ways in which water features in the book. It's partly about the absurdity of the idea of writing a history of water, right? You can't write a history of water because water is the same in all periods and in all places, right? And therefore, it's kind of a joke to draw attention to the fact that when we write history, we have to make artificial divisions between time periods and between geographical locations in order to make sense of the world, right?
So have other publishers allowed, in other languages, have they allowed the same title? Or
so the Italians,
country have its own?
The Italians, it's in Italian, it is Una Storia d'Acqua. In Spanish, they've got a totally different title. Because again, they wanted to suggest to Spanish readers that despite being about Portugal, that it was sort of Iberian in some general sense. So the espalda. So in Spanish, it's el poeta y el archivero, so the poet and the archivist. Un nueva épica del expansión ibérica. Vale, sí. I'm usually presented with these things as a fait accompli.
Don't be so nationalist. At the time we speak Spanish also in Portugal. We speak both languages.
Publishers are very good at sending these
Camões
things.
wrote a lot of poems in Spanish.
Publishers are very good at sending these things on Friday afternoon saying, very sorry, but we need to know now because we're going to press on Monday. Yeah. But also, I mean, I think part of it is, and there's a part of the book when I write about Camões' shipwreck, that, there's a lovely thing about water that our experience of water is something that, if not quite acultural, there's a lot of shared experience across culture. But also, I think the experience of being adrift in water is quite similar, I think, to the mise en abîme, the abyss into which Europeans stared when confronted with a world in which their most cherished truths were shown to be possibly just theirs, not universal, not necessary, not natural, but just their own story about the world. And I think that everyone, I'm sure, has had this experience of getting out just a bit too deep or diving into the ocean off a boat in the middle of the ocean, and what it feels like to not have a reference point, to feel like everything might stretch infinitely in every direction, and you suddenly don't have a way in which to orient the world. It's a profoundly shocking and disturbing experience. And again, everyone's reaction: swim for the boat, find something solid to hold on to. And again, I think, in part, what Camões offers to Europeans in this period is something to hold on to. He gives them a boat, right? And I think so that, again, it's probably just my addiction to making up titles.
Did the Americans allow it?
It doesn't have an American edition yet because whilst the previous book, which was about the bastard son of Christopher Columbus and his quest to build a universal library, had an American connection, the Americans are not terribly interested in anything that doesn't have an American connection, like the Spanish. Yeah. So again, but this is, it's grist to the mill of, we're still so profoundly nationalistic. the idea that, and it's true, and the English book market is just as bad about this. You write anything about the Tudors, right? It can be codswallop, and it will sell because this is the English national story about their own greatness, right? You know, the reason why I have a job is because every English department in every English-speaking country in the world has to have a Shakespeareanist, right? Because that is the underpinning of the national character, right? So England is just as bad. Tell a story about the Tudors or about the Second World War, which is again the great Game of Thrones style, you know, the triumph of Churchill over Hitler, that time when England saved the world. Don't mention the Eagles or the Americans, you know. These things sell very well. Any story about anyone else, it's very difficult to get it read. You know, it's a challenge, and again, it's profoundly disturbing how easily we are persuaded to take interest in people who we are told are like us, and how difficult we find it to take an interest in people who we think maybe aren't like us. So again, I think, you know, your session yesterday, I think was profoundly encouraging, and I wonder about this new age of globalization and whether the answer isn't, you know, a kind of local you know, grassroots globalization where, you know, maybe it's the Greater Bay Area and just learning, you know, we all now live in profoundly cosmopolitan neighborhoods, and just learning to take an interest in the story of the person across the bay or across the road who has, you know, a different background to you is, you know, perhaps a different way to think about that rather than great policies or anything like that.
We have Brexit.
Just a quick question.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and again...
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Has living with this book and writing this book changed you and your perspectives on historical narratives? And if so, how?
Well, so I think, yes. I mean, obviously I had some shape of an idea going into it, but I think it has profoundly brought home to me the significance of narrative in the shaping of history. And I don't mean, it is the case that people shape histories in a narrative way, and, you know, I'm trying to tell this book in a way that's engaging, that will make people who don't care about this kind of thing care about it. But I also mean, you know, like Camões offering to the Europeans something to cling on to, a story that they can tell themselves in which they remain the hero, that being powerful. Again, I think I'm increasingly just taken aback by how true that is about our world, right? So Brexit, Trump, right? You know, we talked, in some ways we talk about the power of economics in the modern world, but actually we live in a world in which people act in profoundly economically disinterested, unself-interested ways. They shoot themselves in the foot, right? They leave a perfectly functional customs union, or, you know, they put a crazy man in charge of the country, right? A crazy man who's clearly also a mafioso-style criminal. Why? Because he offers them a narrative. He offers them a narrative in which they continue to be at the center of the world, in which there continues to be an identifiable enemy. Build a wall, yeah, they're coming for us, right? The wokerati, whatever, you know, identify an enemy. Give people a narrative that they can tell themselves that in which the world makes sense to them, and they will do anything for you, right? And this is the lesson of Trump. This is the lesson of Brexit. So yeah, I mean, I think that...
Have the characters, Camões and Damião de Góis, changed you?
Oh, absolutely.
Living with them for a while.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, again, I think being a, you know, being a biographer is a profoundly strange experience. I mean, I think I'm not... so I have now written 2 biographies. Actually, I'm finishing a 3rd biography at the moment. And my biographies are not like I think biography was in the past. They're not hero worship. I'm not trying to document the life of some great figure so that you can understand their genius and how they came to be that fated person. I'm more interested in people who live lives in which there are different pieces that don't seem to fit together to us. Right, so Damião was involved in the Reformation, but also writing about Ethiopia and India and China. And again, one of the profoundly interesting things for me working on something like this is, as someone who has had a career on the early modern period, on the 16th and 17th century, which is this period in which there is this extraordinary leap forward in global connection. I was still taught, and it's still the case, that people think of a lot of these issues as profoundly local, right? The Reformation is something that happens in Europe. And the fact that they are meeting Hindus and Buddhists and Taoists and people in South America at the same time, no, that has nothing to do with it. And I was profoundly dissatisfied by that idea. And again, you don't have to scratch very hard to find that that's obviously not true. That is in itself a kind of a narrative, right? A narrative of our history being about a story about us, right? And other people can come into it as kind of cameo characters every now and then, but the real story is about us, right? So that's so it's not like I hero worship these people, but again, it's very difficult, especially with someone like Damião, who I think was such an extraordinary figure and so ill-treated by his time and by the future, that it's very difficult not to become extremely protective and possessive and of some of the subjects. So yes, I think Damião. I think he's made me appreciate. I think Camões has made me appreciate the importance of story. I think Damião has made me realize the importance of our need to re-enchant the world. So Damião's belief in mermen, in part, and I was thinking about this during the Lord of the Rings session previously, about why the Lord of the Rings should be so popular nowadays and across the world. We were talking about Tolkien being in some ways influenced by modernism, but of course he's wholly against the kind of verisimilitude of modernism, right? And he is entirely about myth and the power of myth and the structures of myth. But again, I think, the world is an infinitely complicated place, and one of the ways in which people understand that is through telling stories and through creating myths. And I think it's just, it's important that we recognize that. It's obviously important that we recognize the problems of living in a post-truth era. But I think it's also important to recognize how much people need stories. They need stories to understand the world, and we need to be telling the stories that help them to understand the world in good ways, in ways that lead to tolerance and empathy, and because there's plenty of people telling the other story, and from where I'm sitting, they're winning at the moment. Well, let's. Maybe I'm an optimist. I'm also an optimist, but yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, more questions, please.
Yes, I do. Hello, Edward.
Hello, Sarah.
I'm sorry about my English, okay?
No, I'm much more sorry about my Portuguese.
Yes, okay. I still in the title, because I like both.
Yeah.
TORRE dos Segredos, it's very special, and it's the theory of water also, because it's a way, and a very deep way in that time. But my question is about the second part. You see, because we have the interconnected lives, and I can understand that, and I agree with that. But in Portuguese, we have os mundos paralelos, and they are very quite opposite meaning.
Yeah.
Mundos paralelos, they don't mix, never. So, I would like very much if you can tell us what is the right meaning for you. Is the interconnect lives or mundos paralelos, they don't mix?
Well, as you will know, as many people in this room, writers will know, if the conversation about the title is fraught, the conversation about the subtitle is even more fraught, because they tend to allow the writer to have their way on the title with the proviso that the publisher's allowed to say something in the subtitle that will get people to buy it.
Sorry, because I think they can be both right.
Yes.
Because the world of Damião de Góis and the world of Luís de Camões, they are very different. So perhaps he's right also. But what do you think it's righter?
Yeah, I mean,
That's okay. It's an open question.
The Interconnected Lives is just the title of this talk. It's not the title of the English. So again, the title of the subtitle of the English edition has an even different subtitle. I was slightly confused there. So, subtitle of the English edition is "Being an Account of a Murder, an Epic, and Two Visions of Global History," which. Again, I could go on about the fact that this is a tribute to Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his first book, which has an extremely, excessively, humorously long subtitle, but I won't. Yes. And again, there are ways in which it's important that the worlds are both parallel and interconnected, but I can't talk about it because that would spoil the end of the book. Which we haven't even mentioned yet is a murder mystery, because as a gift to a biographer, not only does Damião de Góis have a fantastically interesting life, he also dies in a mysterious and unexplained way. So the story is actually constructed as a murder mystery, solving, I hope, or having a go at solving the mystery of Damião de Góis's murder.
Yes, it's a little bit troubling when you say us that science, like history, still divide us in dichotomic visions, etc., etc. But of course, it is the truth since its beginnings, and still it is, right? And it's very nice to listen to a historian that has consciousness of that and acknowledges that, because sometimes we are confronted with truths that come from documents and whatever, but okay, they are ideological motivated most of the times. So, yes, one more. Glenn.
I'm glad I was going to ask you about your narrative as a murder mystery, but I didn't want to be a bit of a spoiler alert, so I didn't. But Carlos talked about the importance of myth and storytelling. One thing you haven't discussed, you were going to, is the myth or story, did Camões come to Macau?
God, yes. I can't believe we didn't. So, yes. So the simple answer is, I think, yes. As certain as we can be about anything. So again, one has to remember important, canonical figures provoke conspiracy theories, right? Because there's something to be gained from claiming you have a new theory about them, or claiming you have a new idea. Really, like Shakespeare, Camões, we know very little about his life, but the claims about him having spent time in Macau as the proveedor dos bens dos defuntos was made by people who knew him very well and who had no real reason to make it up.
But many Portuguese historians write articles saying he never came to Macau. So these, obviously, I assume he did, but some people, as you said, some people have a reason to create this.
They found no documents. They found no documents, like a document from the Portuguese crown saying Camões is the...
But again, with the loss of so many of the documents from the Torre do Tombo in the 1755 earthquake, it's not all that surprising.
It was also a very early time of Macau, so nothing was really settled yet. Right?
In fact, I believe there were many people who served in the post of the proveedor dos bens de defuntos. There's only one royal document laying out. So actually it would have been quite surprising if there was a document. Again, a lot of this has to do with the misunderstandings that can be creatively played upon about how historical documentation works. The fact that, Shakespeare was a nobody, being a playwright was not something that people took a lot of interest in, so there wasn't a lot of documentation about Shakespeare's life or his career, and this allows people to say, aha, you see, someone like that, they would definitely have had lots of documents about it. But this has happened in our own lifetimes. I often say to my students who want to go down this route, look at a lot of early Hollywood films. We don't know who wrote them. right? Because being a screenwriter was not a reputable thing to do. So people wrote pseudonymously, and just no one bothered to write down who wrote the film.
And Obama was born in Kenya.
Well, as a proud Kenyan, but similarly, early websites and things like that. Presumably, with hindsight, we will see that these were profoundly important documents. Moments in our culture, these early websites. But I mean, I was there in the 90s where they were being made. I wasn't going to sit there and do a kind of ethnography of early bloggers or something like that, because they weren't people who I thought worth writing things down about. And I think both. But so similarly with Camões and Shakespeare,
yes,
their fame is posthumous, and so
But the importance of Camões in Macau, I think, is one of these cases that the myth is more important than reality. I mean, because it's important for us Portuguese that Camões was in Macau. Why? And also the presence of Camões in this grotto. This grotto symbolizes our presence. It's not the Fortaleza do Monte, it's not the fort, it's the grotto. And so it allows us to say that we are here to spread poetry and love instead of cannonballs and slaves. So and businessmen. Although this was made by businessmen, but it's
like
true. In our own mythology of Portuguese in Macau, of the Portuguese community in Macau, this has been working like that. Camilo Peçanha writes it, Vincent Morais writes it. We found that this is the symbol of our presence. It's the Camões Grotto. This is the real symbol. What does it emanate from there? Poetry, love, because of the love between him and the man. All this is a myth. I'm not talking this is true. I was even suggesting very pervert things about that grotto by the place where it was and by the interests that Camões always shows when he gets some place and why he was there. There were some flocks of birds and why is it called the Garden of the Doves? What doves are those? It's all a little bit complicated, perhaps. But the myth in this case is more important than the history.
Yes, and I do actually talk about this a bit in the book, but yes, I think we're being played off. So.
Okay, so thank you very much. I hope you buy the book, and especially you read the book. Because it's a very interesting book. I could not stop it and didn't finish it because the notes, then I want to go through the notes. So thank you very much for your presence, and please.
Thank you. Thank you.